Hello and welcome everybody. Today I am going to recap day 3 of Magic Camp with all kinds of photos and videos that were taken throughout the day. Let's get started. We are starting off with standard and we're thinking about who's ahead or behind at any given point throughout the game.
Standard changes your decisions a lot, and generally I think in order for us to be able to make good plays, especially because I think a lot of people are kind of working through pausing and slowing down, this will be the mechanism to make it so when we're pausing and slowing down, we have a concrete thing that we're going to be thinking about. Does anyone have thoughts or questions before we start this drill? You got it, Robbie.
So what's a good baseline for evaluating cards in hand? Unknown. If core map has 5 cards in hand that I don't know, is there a good way of comparing that to what if I have a sort of battlefield advantage? Is an exchange rate or anything?
Well, so this is why we're going to be using the deck list to sort of inform.
Core map might have board life.
So I think the idea we're talking about is less specific to, does your opponent have 2 or 3 cards in hand, or is there a read on the specific card, but more that when you look at your hand and you're deciding what game, what action you want to make, that you should have some sort of plan for what your plan is to win the game. A lot of the conversations I had with many people yesterday was we were playing our cards, and I'd say, why did you make this play? And they'd say, well, I didn't want to die. And I was like, okay, so we're trying not to lose the game. In order to not lose the game, we need to win the game. What's our plan to do that? And so that's, I think, a big part of the framing of when we're deciding exactly what things we want to do. It's a little bit more on the broad side.
Sure. I mean, I would add to that too that to your point, Robbie. If you're trying to evaluate based on what cards is my point of access to, it would be helpful for you to try to look at specifically what are the cards that I currently care about based on my hand. Similar to how yesterday we were trying to figure out what cards our opponent could have based on them making less than optimal plays, right? Like we talked about in Modern. This is more through the frame of when I'm evaluating how ahead or behind I am, I want you to think about what the scariest card is from the opponent's hand, and if there are any cards that are not particularly scary, you have a good plan to answer those cards. Maybe you decide I'm ahead. So my goal in this is you don't have to be right or wrong with your evaluation, but I want each side of the matchup to make an evaluation that you can justify.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you don't get bonus points for being ahead or behind, only for properly evaluating your spot in the game. So,
bonus points?
unfortunately
One
not.
life, my opponent has 10 creatures.
What we're going to be doing as coaches is walking around, checking in, asking you guys questions as we play some standard. And one thing we also noticed between Modern and Standard that's different, right, is the Standard games end up being much longer, and inevitably that means you have more turns to work through than Modern, where the game is decided often in 4 or 5. So we're going to be focused on trying to make our best decisions early on in the game, but call over a coach if you have any questions, and if you're unfamiliar with your opponent's deck, especially when you're trying to evaluate how ahead or behind you are, that's a good spot to check in with a coach and talk with your opponent about. Any other questions before we get started with some gameplay?
Can I see your deck list?
Before we get started,
This
so
is Paul.
I've met all you guys, I think, at this point. I'm Paul. I'm your extra coach. I've staffed this weekend, but it's been great to meet all y'all. I'll help out with whatever you need.
Now we're moving on to limited.
Mention this, but I'm going to continue this because we talked about it in Construct already. The main focus for today is we want to get better at constructing game plans. And first, I want to field some general questions. 1, what are your guys' current plans when you're playing a game of Limited? How do you approach playing Limited? One thing we talked about yesterday was in Constructed, you have a defined archetype that lets you know what you're supposed to do, right? What is the difference between doing so in Limited versus Constructed? Let's start there. Robbie?
I mean, you don't know what you're going to play in Resident beforehand. It might be that you feel really comfortable with a red-white aggro deck, but you might be opening your draft, you might just not be there. like might be like have to like move out control. That's the limit.
So, sort of the idea that your limited archetype changes depending on what you draft in a given seat. When we think about that, there's also this concept of what is a control deck in limited versus a control deck constructed, right? Like, what does a definitional control deck mean? I'm curious, like, how do you define that for a limited deck?
I mean, I feel.
Go ahead, Robbie.
I think of like a control deck in limited to be a deck that's like built around neutralizing early creatures that your opponent plays, like they're good like 3-4 drops, and then having late game big bombs and lots of like removal and general interaction with some card advantage.
So generally, if you have a deck in limited that is a control deck, it has some form of inevitability in the late game, right? You guys are all familiar with the idea that we talked about this in constructed, but inevitability is like at the end of the game, if it keeps going on for turns and turns, I should be favored because of my deck, right? So when you're playing control deck constructed, that usually means you have a lot of card advantage, right? You have your stock ups or whatever else to make sure you win the late game. But in limited, that can kind of change beyond what your deck is, because sometimes you're playing a matchup where you can't be a control deck. Your opponent has some card that you have no real plan for, right? Noah, I was asking you earlier too, but I wanted to hear your thoughts because we've talked about this in limited before. When you're drafting like an archetype, for example, red-white aggro in a format, are there places where that red-white aggro deck is no longer necessarily an aggro deck?
Yeah. Like, if you get a good card that makes you play a little, that is really expensive, you might have to change your game plan to be a little slower and more of a mid-range deck. So then you can take some of the more better mid-range cards and change your strategy through the draft.
That's a good answer for during the draft. I would like to comment on a somewhat, maybe a tangent, maybe somewhere else. I was going with this. Another answer to when your red-white aggro deck might not be an aggro deck is if your opponent also has a somewhat aggressive deck and they're on the play. It's like because limited decks are often pretty strategically similar to each other. They're just like reasonable cards. It's a lot more common for the person to be on the play to be the aggro in that game. Yep.
You can often get like decks that are generally aggressive. Like I mean, for instance, in last night's draft, like that evening's draft, I had like a green-red deck, and its curve basically tops out at 4 and has very aggressive stuff, except it has like the 1/7 drop that gives like your whole board like vigilance and haste for like landfall. And so, if that card happens to be like in your hand, then you might be able to play a more controlling game, knowing that you can play that and like win the game turn after. But you might otherwise be playing a very aggressive deck. Like
there are people who have claimed that every limited deck is a mid-range deck, in that like you generally want the ability to like have something in your deck that'll like let you play in the late game, because like your mana's kind of bad, you might not like have a really aggressive draw. Like the games are scrappier. You need to be able to like take on more roles, so you want to have like cards that have you covered when that happens. I would say it's not literally true. Like there are decks that can be like super focused, all in. This is either going to work or it doesn't. There are also decks that are like, I literally don't have a plan to attack my opponent ever. But way more limited decks are mid-range decks than like most constructed formats.
Right, and to that extent, there's also this idea that like when you're defining your rule in limited, you have to classify it as like something that can very easily change depending on the context of the game, whereas maybe if you're playing constructed deck, it's so focused that it's going to do that thing, like Amulet Titan, for example, is going to do that thing as much as it can. It's not going to exactly switch to being an aggro deck ever because it doesn't have the tools to do so. Like Sam said about play draw disparity, you're evaluating your deck not in a vacuum, but contextually with the cards that you have in front of you. So the main reason I'm introducing this here is just to say, when you're drafting, your deck can usually play multiple roles. When you're building it well, an aggro deck can often break through in the late game because you have a specific plan or an idea of cards that allow you to either gain evasion or have some form of, in the late game, I can win. Like, very rarely do we get to a point in a limited game where we're like, if I can survive until turn 6, I'm going to win because they're the aggro deck and I'm the control deck, right? That doesn't really happen too often. So the main focus that I want to place is when we're playing our games today, one, trying to get in the mindset of, okay, what role am I taking on in this game and what is the reason I'm taking on this role? Either, you know, a particular card that's giving you a source of late game advantage or a card from the opponent's side that gives them some source of advantage. And that card doesn't have to be on the battlefield. It could just be the presence of a card in the opponent's deck that gives them an advantage, for example.
Because we are talking about like roles of limited decks, and like it's pretty obvious what an aggro deck looks like and how to draft an aggro deck and how to identify an aggro deck. Given that a control deck is the deck with inevitability, in a constructed format you can like build a control deck with an understanding of what the late game plans of the other decks are in the format to know that you have inevitability against the ones that you're trying to beat at least. In limited, how can you know that you have inevitability when you don't necessarily have access to the strongest cards in the format and other people might because you just have whatever you open? Does anyone have thoughts on like what it means and how you can actually be a deck with inevitability?
I mean, like, if you have cards that can generically answer things, like, it doesn't matter whether you're entering, you know, a red 6-drop or a green, you know, 5-drop or whatever. If you have, you know, your, like, Gravakill or whatever.
Right, so flexible removal spells, counter spells are a good way to make sure that whatever bomb your opponent has doesn't mean that they're favored in the long game. What else can you do? So that's a good way to know that you have a shot going along. What can you do to like know that you're like just have a reason to believe that you're going to be favored rather than just like, okay, we trade, but what if they draw another bomb? Like how do you make sure that you have a better late game?
Maybe like card advantage?
No?
If they just have one bomb and then some cheap creatures, you can do better. What?
Sorry. The mention of bomb made me laugh.
Okay. So, if they just have one bomb and you have a bunch of cheap creatures, you can just, and they have a bunch of cheap creatures, you can just have like some bigger creatures and some more expensive creatures to make sure that you can still do well in the late game against big bombs.
So do you think having a bunch of expensive creatures is the best way to have inevitability?
No, but a fair amount, like 5.
I think what you're trying to say by that is essentially like, if your opponent's curve is lower than yours, inherently cards that are more expensive, not inherently, but most of the case cards that are more expensive are worth more than cards that are cheaper. That's just how mana curves work in Magic, how costs are related. So, for example, a card your opponent plays on turn 2 should be generally weaker than a 7 mana card you cast on turn 7, right? And so one form of inevitability might be, okay, my deck has a lot of expensive cards and ways of getting to those expensive cards, therefore I believe I can win those late games more often. Can be your own bomb that allows you to do that, one that doesn't trade for a single removal spell. But the point is, having inevitability comes in a few different forms, and the way that you want to maximize it in limited is by recognizing, what is the ultimate form of inevitability between these two decks, if there's a singular card, or what pieces of your deck give you, larger than a small advantage. Like sometimes the two decks are very closely matched, in which case the context of the game really defines who has inevitability rather than anything else.
So, Nate brought it back around to two decks, how your deck lines up against your opponent. When you're drafting, you have no idea what your opponent is going to have or what your opponents collectively might have. So this idea of if the total mana cost of your deck is higher than the total mana cost of your opponent's deck. So you can play a really long game where you're basically just comparing decks, and you're like, well, my creatures in total are bigger, so I'm probably favored. That's kind of what I would describe as a dinosaur strategy, where you're just I have the big guys. I often describe that kind of deck as big proactive, where you're trying to win based on the fact that your numbers are bigger than your opponent's numbers. And the reason that I say proactive there is if you don't have like strong sources of card advantage, and your opponent can just like use removal spells that are agnostic of the size of your creatures, then you actually don't have inevitability against the decks that are like better set up for really long games than the like big decks. So this idea of just like add up the total mana value is somewhat useful. Where I want to go with this is the winner of a game of Magic is very often the person who spends more mana in that game. The reason that aggro decks are favored in short games is that they're more likely to spend their mana on turns 1, 2, and 3, whereas like a deck with more expensive cards in it might not spend their mana on turn 1, 2, or 3, and so then they need to have a turn where they can outspend their opponent on mana later in the game to catch up from the fact that their opponent spent more mana than them earlier. And the issue with the I just have more big creatures thing is if you run out of stuff to do, and there's a turn where you spend no mana and your opponent like casts a card, draws spell, and plays some more stuff, and your opponent outspends you by 7 mana, that can be like really easy for them to pull away based on, or really hard for you to recover from. So my answer to how do you make sure that you have enough ability is draft in such a way that you never stop spending your mana. So card draw is a good way to get that. Activated abilities, mana sinks, are a good way to make sure that like as the game goes on, you're pulling further ahead every turn, and there's never a turn where you're just like at the mercy of drawing another spell to keep outpacing your opponent on mana stint. So to me, the answer to like how do you make sure you have inevitability is mana sinks and card draw, not big numbers.
I think a good example that we talked about yesterday when it came to like inevitability, a card that might not have looked as good but was very good in that draft format. The perfect example of that was Essence Reliquary. It was a 3 mana spell, and that spell made it so that you had something to do every turn for the rest of the game it was in play. And it meant that you were always had that ability to spend more mana than your opponent on things that you got to choose. Like we talk about card advantage, one of the problems can be that some of our your decks have a certain amount of cards and a certain amount of lands, and we want to try to make sure that we're preventing from situations where like you only draw lands or things like that. And so being able to spend more mana is a result of like these mana sinks. Engines is another thing that like we'll talk about throughout the weekend. I think I brought that up with Cormac yesterday in one of our games. And so those are things that can make put individual cards together and they get stronger together.
Yeah, another example like of how this plays out in practice is sometimes you run into board states where you simply can identify your opponent has a card that you don't have ways of managing in your deck, and so you have a role that you have to take on as a result of it. Like yesterday, it's just an uncommon. It's not a rare or anything, but I was watching you, Cormac, play against Nora, and you had access to what's the Chocobo Racetrack card called?
Yeah, the social engineer.
The social engineer, whatever, the 5 mana landfall card. Whenever you play a land, put a 2/2 in play. That's obviously a form of inevitability, right? Where every turn you get to make another 2/2. Therefore, you don't have a density of bad draws in your deck because your worst draw is going to be worth approximately a 2/2. And so at that point in the game, he had 2 copies of this card. It was like the only way that this game ends in your favor or against these 2 engines in play is if you somehow turn the game into, I'm going to make your life total the most important resource in my head. Like in my mind, that's what I'm going to focus on. So identifying what the resource is that you're going to fight on to win a game is part of what we want to focus on when creating a game plan here.
Do people understand the options there? Like what resources can a game be about?
Yep.
Card advantage, like total mana, and like maybe like a planeswalker's loyalty.
Deck size, yeah.
Deck,
Yeah.
board presence, just like who has more bigger bodies.
Yeah, that one was one that I think was super relevant. That like we had a little bit of a problem yesterday. I think we all have a pretty good concept of wanting to spend all of our mana on a given turn. I know Dana and I had a specific moment about this where we considered taking a different and did take a different action as a result of we had a lot of lands and we didn't spend all of our mana on our second turn. We took a different action, and My brain just stopped working. What was
Creature board advantage. Like
yeah, I'm talking about board states. So, you know, a lot of the time it was like, I think in that example, we could have cracked our lander token, and we would have used our 2 mana, and we would have gotten a land. Or we could have played our 1 mana creature, which gave us a 2/2 on the board, which was either blocking a 1/2 or, you know, applying pressure towards our opponent. It was developing our board in some sort of way, and we had no good way to use that like land later. A lot of the time I think we've been using our selection spells on like turn 2 or 3 instead of playing a creature. And one of the things that applies pressure to your opponent and, you know, prevents them from always being able to do whatever they want and run away with the game is board presence. And so that is one of the things that can kind of determine who has the advantage in the game kind of early, is who has the stronger board presence.
Just a thing I wanted to add, but one thing I want everyone to try implementing today is super easy to implement but harder to actually actively think about it, and we're going to focus on that, is when you're attacking or blocking, be ready to justify why you are doing so in a game. Because I saw a lot of yesterday, well, I guess I should attack here, my opponent just attacked, I'm going to attack back, and then a turn later, oh, now I have to be defensive, I'm going to try blocking now. Once you realize, oh wait.
They attacked because they're the aggressor.
They attack because they are trying to deal me damage. And so, in combat, one thing I'm going to be coming around and just double checking on is, can you make a clear claim as to why you are either taking an aggressive line of attacking, or if you are sitting back and waiting? Even if that means, you know, attacking with a 1/1 into your opponent's, you know, board of nothing versus my hand will win in 4 or 5 turns, so it's not worth attacking in case, you know, there's some disaster scenario. Stuff like that I saw yesterday. Yes, Sam?
Another big thing that I saw come up a few times yesterday was how to evaluate the question of whether to spend your mana playing a creature versus playing a removal spell. I think that the best baseline is a creature being in play does something, and a removal spell can trade with one thing, and it could trade with the thing that you see right now, but maybe it'll get better next turn because your opponent will play a better thing for it to trade with, whereas the creature is not going to get better by being in your hand. So when in doubt, play the creature that can accumulate value over turns just by being on the battlefield, whereas like basically removal spells get better turn after turn by being in your hand because they get more options. Creatures get better turn after turn by being on the battlefield because they can do work on the battlefield. So when there's any doubt, play the creature rather than the removal spell. This is like generally true, especially if like I can play a creature that might like give my opponent a bad attack or invalidate their creature or like set up a double block. There are some spots where you're like under a lot of pressure. You're like, if I play this creature, I'm hoping to block, but if they remove it, I'm gonna like take so much damage that I'm gonna die, and then you need to play the removal spell. That would be an exception to the like when in doubt. But just remember that the baseline is play the creature rather than the removal spell, and also think about, am I going to need to kill my opponent's creature like in the long term, or do I have a creature in my hand that I can play next turn or a turn later that will invalidate that creature? The other reason that you might need to use a removal spell rather than playing a creature is, does their creature generate some kind of persistent value? Like, not a few damage, I don't care about a few damage, but is it going to like make an object for them? Is it going to draw them cards? Is it going to like do something where like I really just don't want it to happen? Because
Paul says more rectangles.
Yeah, so like in a spot where like they have a utility creature, it's like more likely that you would need to use a removal spell on it rather than just like playing a creature. But
The thing I want to highlight, and I'm not going to go in depth, but I think you brought it up, was the situation that you're in where you're slightly behind on board and you're trying to evaluate, do I play a creature into a removal spell or do I deploy my own removal spell? This is a thing that happens a lot that's hard to evaluate, which is like, am I going to have to play this creature a turn later and lose to a removal spell, therefore I should just get it down now? Or if I play a removal spell this turn, can I take off enough pressure that if they kill my next turn's creature, I'm in an okay spot? So I know this is, you know, a lot of what we're talking about is very theoretical and vague, but hopefully from this what you can take is like, okay, when we're playing today, we're going to focus a lot on assessing what my role is in a given game and how you're defining your opponent's strategy compared to your own.
Right. So like a concrete example of this is like your opponent has like the 3-mana vanilla 7/2 from the format that had that. If you play a blocker, they kill your blocker, they hit you for 7. That's a massive chunk of life. That could be a problem. If you use your removal spell, you kill their only creature. Now, if you play a creature, you're not under as much pressure. Even if they play a creature to follow up after you kill their creature, it's probably not going to have 7 power.
I think
Yeah, perfect. Go ahead, Paul.
So the thing I'm going to probably be asking all of y'all while you're playing your games today is about pressure. And we've said pressure, 6 or 7 times, and it's kind of hard to think about what pressure is. But every time I'm playing a game of Limited, I'm thinking of what pressures are being applied to me that are affecting my ability to win the game, and how I can influence the game to make it so that I'm more likely to win. This is pressure, and you should be able to try at least to identify what things are exerting influence on the outcome of the game in that sense.
So one of the things that we said, the thing that prompted this conversation yesterday when we were playing Limited is, like, I would come up to a lot of people and I'd be like, what was your plan? I think at this point we've all enjoyed the conversations between me and Cormac where I said, why did you play that card? And he wouldn't be able to answer me. And I'd be like, okay, well, did you consider playing this other card? And he'd be like, no, I didn't.
If you have enough mana to cast a spell, you
No
should
thoughts,
consider
only
doing
spell.
it. Just think about what would happen if you did it.
So I think the goal today is that when you play games of Limited, you want to every single action you take in the game to have intent. Like, that's the biggest thing. When
Sure
we're
is.
playing Constructed, I think Amulet Titan is like the perfect example of this. We know that if we hit, 3 or 4 lands, we're winning the game on the spot, and it no longer matters what our opponent is doing. That is just like not true in Limited. The games are scrappier than that. They're not quite as strong, and so a lot of the games are about making a plan and trying to accomplish that plan in whatever way you can, and that requires intent in how you play your cards. Every action you take should be for some sort of reason, and you should be able to qualify that. And so, I think a perfect example of this was yesterday. We spent some time with Cormac, and we spent some time thinking through our turns, and then I walked up to Charlie and I said, hey Charlie, why did we take this game action? And I got a paragraph answer. And one of the things you'll see when you hear people talk about Limited games that they really like and that are really in depth is that, at the end of the game, they'll be able to tell you every game action they took on a specific turn and why. They'll remember that. I can tell you that yesterday I played a game against Nathan, and I had made this very established plan where there was a red card that if it was dealt damage, would deal damage to your opponent, and I had a creature, or I had the vehicle that said, when it attacks, you can deal 100 damage to target creature. So I had made this very clear game plan in my head where I was going to shoot my own creature and shoot Nathan in the face for 100. And I'm not going to forget that, despite the fact that it happened last night when I was dying. I don't want to talk about that part. But I had, intent, and I had thought about my game actions as a result, and so I remember those things.
And then she lost an unlosable game because
Hey, you should do this in Constructed too.
That's true. I didn't say I had intent to win the game. I said that I had intent to shoot your face for 100.
So when you're playing your games, just imagine if we're not watching you, we might step over at any moment and ask you why you made the play you just made, and you want to be able to say something.
Act like there's always
Don't
a
make
cool
it up.
thing over your shoulder.
we have not talked about the draft portion at all. I know everyone's eager to draft, but last thing I'll say is please be considerate, at least in pack 1, of how can you leave yourself open for opening a good card pack 2 or pack 3. Cormac, I'm not trying to call you out.
But I want to play the 5 colors.
no one, not specifically Cormac, not anyone.
I can point to somebody else. Dana did it too.
And also, while drafting, make sure to be considerate of the fact that I really want to win. And so,
I'll consider that. Thanks for letting me know.
It's easy to,
He wants to earn it, is what he's saying.
yeah.
it's easy to understand why you wouldn't want to commit to 2 colors in pack 1 if you're like, I might open a bomb and want to play it. It's a little harder to understand that when you commit to 2 colors, your draft is capped on what cards you get past. Like after pack 1, if you're in a 2-color lane, you have way less agency to make decisions at that point because you're not going to be able to shift that easily. So
The other thing I want to say about this draft, yesterday I had people raise their hands when they want help. Today, there are 4 of us, we're each going to sit between two of you,
Great.
and we're going to like help with both the people that we're sitting between. So there will always be someone ready to answer questions.
We had a really fun time drafting, and after the draft finished, we did another fun draft where 2 of the kids teamed up with each other, and then we drafted against the coaches. It was a lot of fun.
Why did we block? Why didn't we block?
That's a great question.
That was ridiculous. I mean, you can ignore half of the
I'm just gonna. Oh wait, you can attack me for one? Huh?
It's your turn, sir.
This does not have perfect. Yeah, oh, you're saying, yeah. Not all of my creatures do have plus 1/+1.
Let's cast a Boreal Gracer and attack with the Boreal Gracer. Can we do that, please?
Okay.
You
know what? I'm just gonna start asking.
I can give them all another plus 1/+1.
Yes, I also have 2 kill spells in my deck, which would have been good. I think it would have been that good.
That's still.
That was a better game than the other ones I played.
No.
Yeah.
I don't think. I think it's
Yeah,
worth
we
it.
swing.
I mean, it's weird because it's like it does.
It's 2 for 1, so yeah.
It does depend on what cards you value in this matchup, or what we value in this
playing?
matchup.
Yeah,
But
One
like,
of us,
so he's
we
at
each
18.
play everyone.
yeah,
We're both at
but
18.
it's 18
You
off.
can do 3 or 4 rounds, whatever people want to do.
I'll play a 2-3.
This concludes Magic Camp Day 3. I hope you enjoyed, and don't forget to like and subscribe this video. Thank you so much, everybody. See you next time.